What's up, everybody? Happy New Year. Just making a little recap video of this past year's 2024 UFC in 2024. Just, talking about, the big takeaways of the year, what happened, some guys to look out for in each division. Starting, obviously, with the heavyweight division, Jon Jones is still champ. Aspinall sounds like he's gonna finally get that shot at the title, just from what I've been hearing on some sources online. But other than that, hopefully we see that fight this year. I have a feeling if we do, we're not going to see it until the end of the year, though. It seems like this is how things have been going in that division, unfortunately. But yeah, those are the big takeaways there. Stipe retired. And as for other contenders in the weight class, it's been relatively the same as the past few years. Obviously, Pavlovich doesn't look as unbeatable as he did. He lost to Aspinall, now he lost to Volkov. And it actually looks like Volkov might be the rising contender in that weight class for either Jones and Aspinall, whoever wins that title fight. And as for Volkov, he just seems to have found a resurgence in his career and in himself. I believe his last loss was to Gon before this past loss to Gon. Honestly, watching the fight, as much as I believe that Volkov should have won, I did have a feeling like we would see it swing the other direction, just because you can't make the fight look even remotely close or give your opponents even a slight edge in one department of the fight. It's just an unfortunate thing. But obviously Volkov, they were presumably 1-1 after the first two rounds. He dominated the third, but because Gon had a submission, I think that nullifies the judge's ability to do a 10-8. I don't know. I've seen them do 10-8s for much less before, so it's a little bit strange. But nonetheless, Volkov did lose that fight by that weird split decision. Arguably should have won, but just because the rounds 1 and 2, they both landed a few shots here and there. The bias comes out eventually. Just an odd fight. Pretty clear for Volkov. I feel like you at least scored a draw, but either way, I feel like his future in the division would be him getting credit as a win for that fight rather than Dana and the matchmakers treating it as a loss, especially considering Dana went over to him after he was walking out of the cage. So I think we'll probably see Volkov get a title shot at some point. If not this year, then 2026. As for the light heavyweight division, Alex Pereira is still the king of the division. Just such a meteoric rise in such a short period of time. I remember watching him fight Adesanya and get that upset win, and then losing to Adesanya, then getting a fight with Jan Blachowicz, a division up. It's been crazy, and absolutely he is fighter of the year. I know there's been some talks of Topuria getting that credit too, which Topuria has done amazing as well. But you can't just count out a guy for that title that's saved so many events, accomplished so much in such a short period of time. I think it was his second or third fight at light heavyweight where he became the champion. I believe it was second. This is just stuff that's so unheard of, especially considering he started in kickboxing. Truly fighter of the year, and in my opinion, at some point will go down as one of the best fighters ever, regardless of combat sport. As for rising contenders, Azamat Mirzakhanov looked great this year. His last win was against Alonzo Menafield by knockout. And Dustin Jacoby's looked great too. Dominic Reyes is back on the rise. Obviously, going back to Mirzakhanov, he's still undefeated. I think he's 14 or 15-0. He was slated to fight Nikita Krylov recently, but that fight fell through. It's just a shame for some of these guys because I think if this were a different time, these would absolutely be championship level contenders. but just with Pereira being at the top, it makes it makes that climb to the top seem so much farther ahead, so much longer. So I don't believe those guys can beat Pereira. But obviously there's always a puncher's chance too. It's just hard to really rank the contenders of that weight class right now with Pereira sitting as champion. I don't know how much longer he has in this division. I think he had interest of going up to heavyweight, but if he plans on reigning for a few years, then a lot of those guys are in trouble for sure. Now for middleweight, Duplessis still the champion. Um, I think like the best way I could describe Duplessis is like if any of you watched Deadpool 2, um, that one character Domino, just no matter how the odds seem, could always pull off a win, could always come out on top. I think that's Duplessis in a nutshell. And I do think maybe um, his lack of technique, in certain aspects of the fight, or making people think that, maybe this guy wasn't going to make it to the top. And I think maybe a lot underestimated him. Now he's slated to fight Sean Strickland in that rematch in this upcoming year. Um, Even though I'm a big fan of Strickland, I still think, regardless of any bias, that Strickland will pull off the win in this one if he plays his cards right and if he gets more aggressive. In his past few fights, like the one against Costa, obviously he has very impressive skills, and I love watching the guy fight. But at the end of the day, he needs to put more of a stamp on these fights, especially when they're going to a judge's decision. So if he wants to beat Duplessis this time, he has to put a stamp on it, especially considering Duplessis, you could tell in these fights, is still evolving. He's came a long way from, I don't know why I'm forgetting it, but that other promotion where he got knocked out by Roberto Sodiq, um, I believe twice, and then the other one was a decision. Um, yeah, I just think that he's evolving, and having fought Strickland once, it's hard to say. Like, we haven't really seen these guys, either of them, in rematches. We've only seen them fight a new opponent every now and then, which does make things interesting. In a rematch setting, everything's different. One of the best rematch fighters was Frankie Edgar. Really is great at making adjustments. But we don't know how these guys are going to do having to fight someone again. So it should be an interesting fight. I think Strickland should win it. Doesn't mean he will. Um, and as for the rest of the guys at middleweight, Anthony Hernandez is a guy to keep an eye on for sure. I think if that guy fulfills his potential, I think he could potentially be a middleweight Cain Velasquez. His fight against Michel Pereira was amazing. A lot of takedown attempts, a lot of volume, and that's kind of what the top five of middleweight is lacking. They don't really have those wrestlers anymore, like the Chris Weidmans, the Luke Rockholds. So I think that's necessary for that top five to really see how these strikers like Strickland and Strickland's not really just a striker, but you know what I mean, like Duplessis, all these guys that have mainly fought these fights on the feet, how they're gonna do against a guy who could really wrestle and grapple them, take them down. And obviously another big one is Hamzat Chimaev. That goes without saying. Um, for him to come in and fight Whitaker after having a long layoff, and to just completely shut him out the way he did, even breaking his jaw with that choke. I mean, we haven't really seen this before in a fighter, especially a fighter in a division that wasn't even ranked prior to this fight. Um, Chimaev, if he plays his cards right and is able to get the takedowns and keep his cardio in check for those championship rounds, will be a nightmare for anyone. Even the guys like Duplessis, Strickland, they're not saying that they'll lose. I think those will be Chimaev's toughest fights for sure, but they definitely won't be able to get by easily. Um, And besides Chimaev and Hernandez, those are really the two that I would keep an eye on in this division. No, three. Kyle Baralho as well. And I think Baralho could potentially be one of the most interesting out of these new contenders, just because of the fact that he does have the grappling, he has the jiu-jitsu, and his striking looked really crisp against Jared Cannonier. So those are the three to keep an eye on. Hopefully, we see Baralho back soon. I don't know who Chimaev and Hernandez are slated to fight just yet. I do believe Chimaev will probably wait out for the winner of Duplessis Strickland. It did seem like Dana White was interested in giving him a shot. So that's going to be exciting in that division. As for welterweight, um, we have Bilal's champion. Shavkat is going to fight Bilal, and I stand by what I said before that Bilal is gonna win that fight. I really think this fight with Gary proved it. I don't think Shavkat is a bad fighter by any means. A lot of people were unfortunately just saying he got fraud checked in the Ian Gary fight. It was an amazing fight from two guys that are probably both going to hold a belt one day regardless. But I think right now, um, with how Shavkat looked in the striking, that Bilal could pull off a win, especially with how Shavkat seemed to give up dominant positions in those later rounds and even almost got finished by Gary. I think that fight was more of a win for Gary than it was uh, for Shavkat. Even in loss, it wasn't really a loss. I think Shavkat lost more from that fight than Gary did actually losing. Um, I think if we're looking at a guy that's going to beat Bilal, I still think it's going to be like Della Maddalena, or even with how Gary looked, I would say Gary's definitely going to be a problem one day. But I think the guy to 100% keep an eye out for is Joaquin Buckley. We just seen him finish Colby Covington. He beat Stephen Thompson before that. This guy will be a champion, mark my words. He's just looked excellent. His wrestling is really good. He has that middleweight strength because he just came from that weight division not too long ago. His power looks amazing. The performance he did against Colby Covington, as a Colby fan, it almost got hard to watch in that last round. And I was glad the doctor stopped it, because that fight was starting to remind me of Justin Gaethje versus Tony Ferguson. With the shots Colby was getting hit with, that he was too tough to back down from. And yeah, Buckley just looked excellent. I think he's a nightmare for anyone in that division. I think his boxing second to none. Definitely keep your eye out for Joaquin Buckley this upcoming year. And so I would say that about wraps up welterweight. There's always new contenders in that division, though. So if I didn't mention anyone, please mention them in the comments. And moving down to lightweight, we still have Islam's champion. He's going to fight Saryukian. And as much as I like both of those guys, if you just had heard what Saryukian was saying in these interviews, talking about the first fight and everything like that, you would really think the first fight was close. And, I don't mean to sound like this, but if you watch that fight, it wasn't really that close. Makhachev made it pretty clear who the better fighter was at that time. And if we're just talking about who evolved more, well, Chimaev went from getting knocked out by Adriano Martins to beating Dustin Poirier and everybody. Charles Oliveira. He's managed to get through all of these guys, and while also having great striking too, which wasn't there before in the beginning. As opposed to Saryukian, had the loss against Gamrot, even if it was a little controversial, looked pretty close though. It was a pretty close fight, and then uh, almost losing to Charles Oliveira, which I think if you're scoring off of who came the closest to finishing the fight, you should give it to Oliveira. But regardless, based off of how close that looked as opposed to how Makhachev looked against Oliveira, MMA math doesn't work. But I do think. Just Saryukian not being able to fully impose his will against Oliveira, um, I do think that's going to play a factor in this fight. And I think Makhachev, regardless if it's on the ground, on the feet, I think he wins this fight pretty straightforward. As for other contenders in the division, Dan Hooker still at the top there. I would just like to see him get a shot at the title. I don't really think he's on the level of those guys, but the guy's been around for a little while now, and he's a dog in there. He fights really hard, and every single time you watch Dan Hooker fight, he's coming to win, and he's not going to back down against anybody. So I would like to see him eventually fight for a title. Same with Renato Moicano. Um, he can't afford to lose, right? That's what he was saying. So, um, hopefully we see both of those guys get a shot at some point. Moicano looked excellent this year. Got through Jalen Turner, got through Benoit Saint Denis, and everybody was talking about how Saint Denis lost so much cred from that fight. I think they got to give more credit to Moicano though. He looked like a top five level fighter in there with his ground game. I haven't seen someone win against another guy who was high level like that since Luke Rocco Lyoto Machida. That's what that fight reminded me of. I thought he looked really excellent on the ground there, and it's tough to say. We have to see him against another top level guy, but I think regardless, he'll be a good fight for any top five guy. And honestly, even though he gets some hate, Paddy Pimblett too, another guy to keep an eye out for. And his striking is getting better. His grappling still looks excellent. He looked great against Bobby Green. The Tony Ferguson fight kind of hurt his credit a little bit, but then coming back and beating Bobby definitely put him back in a good conversation for that division, for contenders. And yeah, that was that in that division. Now moving down to featherweight, Topuria's champion. He's going to be a problem for anybody in that division as champion. Lopez is getting talked for potentially fighting him. I think Topuria could get through that fight. As for Volkanovski, it's really tough to say because when you have two big losses like that, it's hard to say if it was the fact that he had the Makhachev fight so close behind that fight, and it's hard to say. Did he just get caught in both of those fights and he's still the best of that division and he's going to get the belt back and have his comeback story? Or is this truly just another story of you had it and then now you're starting to lose it? Like Tony Ferguson went from on top of the world to, barely never getting a win again in a matter of just a few seconds of a fight could change everything. So it's tough to say with Volkanovski. We need to see him back against not a title fight first to see where he still stands in the division. And we'll see how it goes. As for Holloway moving up, I don't. It's hard to say. I can never count Holloway out. I didn't think he'd be Justin Gaethje, but look at what he pulled off there. So let's just see what fate has in store for Holloway in the lightweight division and go from there. As for the bantamweight division, Merab is now the champion, and then Umar is the number one contender. It's confirmed that they're going to fight next. As for how that fight's going to go, it's too soon to tell, at least for me. They're not very similar. Umar fights a lot differently than his brother and cousin. He's a lot more striking oriented, still grapples a lot, but almost uses his side kicks like their jabs almost, and fights a lot more on the outside. So it should be an interesting fight nonetheless. I don't think it'll be a very flashy fight. I think the fight itself is probably going to go to a decision, but it's still going to be a great one nonetheless. As for contenders, bantamweight's filled with them. You have guys like Marcus McGee. You have guys like Corey Sandhagen still around, and Piotr Jan is on the rise once again. So bantamweight's always very active, so tough to say how that division's going to end at the end of next year. So overall, it's been a great year for the UFC. UFC 300 definitely delivered, even with some of the doubts that were going into it. UFC 300 delivered. We had plenty of great fights, great fighters on the rise like Pereira. Jon Jones came back. A lot going on in 2024. And we also saw some careers end like Chris Weidman. Most likely guys like Clay Guida too, maybe Anthony Smith. So we lost some guys too. But at the end of the day, it was a great year for every division. A lot of exciting and entertaining fights, and looking forward to what the UFC has to present for 2025. So if you could leave a like in the comments, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and until next time, see you later.